Hi all, I am making a video to kind of explain some of the drawing techniques in looking at sugars and just understanding going from this idea of a Fisher projection, which I've shown to the left. This is that linear chain versus our Haythorne projection, which is the cyclical version of a sugar. So remember that for sugars that have 5 or 6 carbons, and sometimes more, they can cyclize into this version, and they go between the linear and the cyclical version. They interconvert between the two. And we're going to talk about how you can take a structure of the linear Fisher projection and turn it into a cyclical version very quickly. So the key here is understanding where the bond is being formed when we are cyclizing the sugar, and then kind of putting all of the pieces that are important into place in the correct way. So I want to note some things before we start this drawing. So looking at the sugar here, you can see the first thing I've highlighted is that it is a keto type sugar. This has a ketone on it, and I can tell because here is the carbonyl carbon. And notice that it is bonded to a carbon here and a carbon here. So it is a ketone. And generally, ketone sugars will have this group highlighted in red, a CH2OH group at the top. Aldo sugars instead will just have a hydrogen here. So that's one way to very easily distinguish them. The other groups that are going to be important are this bottom CH2OH, which all sugars in their Fisher projection will have this bottom group here. And we're going to talk about where that goes during the cyclization. And then this group here is very important. This is the anomeric carbon. And it is going to form a very special type of bond in the end of our cyclization. So I've highlighted this one. This is a very important. It's always the group that is next up away from our bottom CH2OH group. And then the other things you want to pay attention to is all other OH groups along the way through the chain. So these are all chiral groups, and you want to just pay attention to what side of the chain the OH groups are, if they're on the left side or the right side. Okay, so when we cyclize this ring, essentially what's happening is this oxygen on this anomeric carbon here is going to form a bond with the carbonyl carbon. So the ring, if you want to just think about very quickly where the ring is forming, will connect to these two groups. You can see that when I connect these groups, I just want to count the number of carbons that's in the ring. So just look at the circle. You can see there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then to highlight, remember our sugar also forms a bond with the oxygen. So this is a hetero cycle, meaning oxygen becomes part of the ring. So this oxygen you can think of as part of the ring. So we have 6 things in the ring. So there are 5 carbons and an oxygen that form this ring. That means our ring is going to be a 6-membered ring, just like shown in our top right corner here. So now that we know how many things will be in a ring, what's the basic structure of a ring, we can draw our base ring structure. This is going to be a 6-membered ring sugar. Remember that there's always an oxygen in this top portion, and every other point along this ring is our carbon. So there's our 5 carbons that I've highlighted and our oxygen that forms the ring. Now, the next thing I'm going to add on this ring are these 2 groups, whatever they may be. So again, this is a keto, so it has a CH2OH group at the top. If this was an aldo, which we'll show in the next slide, you would have a hydrogen there, and we treat that a little bit differently. But let's place these 2 groups in red. I'm going to start with the CH2OH group at the bottom. This is always here. And as you can see, it actually ends up being on the left side of the ring. This group again is going to be on every sugar that you're looking at that cyclizes. So it's always going to be to the left of the oxygen, and that is this bottom group here. Okay, now whatever the group is at the top here will go to the right of the oxygen. It's on the other end. In this case, it's another CH2OH. So there are 2 groups. Now, what about everything else? This OH group here is actually the oxygen that ended up forming our oxygen in the middle part of the ring. So even though I've highlighted this oxygen to remind you to count the oxygen, if you look at the reaction, it is in fact this oxygen that becomes the final oxygen in the ring. So I'm going to write that in its color to remind you where that oxygen came from. So this OH group in purple, we don't need to worry about placing because it is this oxygen in the ring. Now, for every other oxygen in blue, the way to remember where they go on the ring and what position they go is by taking this whole projection, this whole linear projection, and essentially going from straight up and tipping it over to the right like this. So you're gonna like chop this down like it's a tree, tip it over. So anything that was on the left is now facing up, and anything that was on the right is now facing down. So in this particular example, you can see that we have 3 OH groups that are going to end up on these last spots. Here's the 3 spots where they should go. And if we look at our projection, we have an OH here, here, and here. So I'm going to chop this tree down. And you can see now I have this setup where I have 2 of my OHs that are down and 1 that is up. And just as it is drawn here, we will place them on the ring, reading from left to right the same way, down, up, and then down. So that's where those OHs go. Now, what about this final oxygen that I've highlighted here? on the carbonyl. The oxygen on the carbonyl, remember, is not the one that becomes integrated into the ring. That is this oxygen, this OH group on the bottom. This oxygen becomes a new OH group, and it exists on the carbon to the right. Always here. This again is that anomeric carbon. And that OH group, because it was formerly a carbonyl, doesn't have a position that you can define. It might end up on the left and it might end up on the right, and that just depends on the reaction. So to signify that we're unsure of where it has gone up or down, we draw it with a squiggly line. But that OH group is there. Again, this OH group is very important. It is attached to this anomeric carbon. And we need to remember that it is here and that its positioning is unknown unless we have distinguished its positioning, which I'll get to later. So again, this is where all those groups end up, going from a linear to a cyclical ring. So let's try another example. This time we're going to start with an aldehyde sugar. And again, I'm going to count how many carbons there are that are going to cyclize. And again, I'm connecting from here to here. And I'm just drawing this line in this way to give you a base example, a base idea. Do remember, though, that this is the oxygen that becomes integrated in the ring, and this oxygen forms our new OH group. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then our oxygen, 6 parts of this ring. So yet again, it's going to look like this. It's a 6-membered ring. With an oxygen. All right, let's place all of our other members. So let's do our CH2OH group on the bottom. Okay. This is always drawn up in this way, usually with the bond going up. Now, the other group we have on the top is a hydrogen. That's because this is an aldo sugar, an aldehyde sugar instead. So that means that on this bond to the right, we just have a hydrogen. Usually if it's just a hydrogen, you don't even need to draw it, but I'm going to draw it just to remind you where it came from. Okay, what else do we need to remember? This OH group here became this oxygen, so there's nothing else we need to do with that one. And now we need to place our 3 OH groups that are on our carbon. So if we knock this down from being all on the right, you'll see that these OH groups are all going to face down. So our end will look like this, all of them facing down. Now, the very last thing, of course, is to remember that this oxygen becomes a new OH group that has an undetermined position, and it's on the anomeric carbon. So our squiggly line OH group like this. Now, again, usually you don't have to draw this hydrogen. This could just be drawn with the OH group sitting there and ignoring the hydrogen, like so. And that is how you would draw this final sugar. All right, let's do a little bit more practice. Here's another type of ketone sugar, and I'm going to count how many carbons will form in this cycle. 1, 2, 3, 4, plus our oxygen is 5. So you can see that this is going to be a 5-membered ring instead of a 6-membered ring. And it is a ketone. So let's look at what a 5-membered ketone cyclization would look like. So again, I'm going to start with my CH2OH group on the end. This is always here. And you can see because this is a ketone, we do have another CH2OH group on the other side of the oxygen. Okay. Again, this oxygen on the bottom, this chiral oxygen here, is what became the oxygen in the center here. And our OHs that are in blue, let's deal with them. There are 2 of them. We have, if we draw out our structure, one that is on the left and one that is on the right. And you can see what that amounts to is one that should be facing down. Oh, give me 1 second. Okay, so as I was saying, you can see our OH groups are going to end up in this manner, in which one is up and one is going to be up and one is going to be down. So those would look like this. And then, of course, lastly, this oxygen becomes our final OH group with undetermined positioning. Okay, so this is what a ketone sugar would look like. That was a 5-membered ring. And lastly, let's try doing a final aldo sugar, an aldehyde sugar, that is, as you'll see, going to be also a 5-membered ring. So it has 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons plus our oxygen is 5. So this will also be a 5-membered ring, but this time we have an aldehyde at the top instead of a ketone. Let's put it together as normal. Our CH2OH group as usual. And you will see me draw this sometimes as like just a little bend. Remember that this right here is a carbon. So this is the ball and stick representation of drawing that CH2OH group. So you can draw it in that way as well. So again, this point is that carbon. Okay, and again, we have a hydrogen here at the top, which would of course go on the right side of our oxygen right here. I'm going to draw it for a reminder, but generally we do not have to draw it out as our hydrogens are usually not written. Okay, this has this oxygen as our central oxygen here in the ring. And now let's deal with any other OH groups. So here we have an OH group 2 on the left-hand side. And when we put that down, these become both facing downward. So there's our 2 OH groups there. And finally, our anomeric carbon OH group with undetermined positioning. And we can erase our hydrogen here because generally we don't need to see it. So this is what an aldehyde would look like. Notice that the key difference here when looking at an aldehyde versus a ketone top is the group on the right-hand side. So either this is going to be a CH2OH group if it's a ketone, or it's just going to be a hydrogen if it is an aldehyde. So let's talk more about that anomeric carbons OH group, the OH group that forms in a position. I've been drawing it as a squiggly line. And that's because, again, it can go into an up position or a down position. And depending on where it ends up, we do have a naming scheme for it. We use this alpha and beta to talk about where that OH group is sitting. Now, to determine an alpha or beta positioning, you actually have to look at two things. Where the OH is in relation to where this CH2OH group is. Now, normally that CH2OH group, as I said, is drawn in an up position, but do not be fooled. It is not always drawn in an up position. Sometimes sugars are rotated for view, and in different scenarios, it might be shown in a down position. So what you really want to look at is if these two groups are on the opposite side or the same side as each other. If they are on the opposite side, which is as shown in this drawing, this would be labeled an alpha OH group, an alpha anomeric carbon. If they are on the same side, doesn't matter if they're both up or both down, if they're just on the same side, we would call that a beta positioning. So we can look at an example. Here's another ring. I'm going to do a 6-membered ring. And this is going to be a ketone 6-membered ring. So it has an CH2OH group on both sides here. Let's say it has some OH groups like this, and its final OH group is pointed in this direction down like this. So again, I want to look at just this group here, this CH2OH group, and this group. And you can see in this case, they are on the opposite side. So this would be labeled alpha. Another important thing when we start talking about bonding sugars together is understanding their numbering system. Once you have a ring and you understand where everything is positioned on the ring, going from a Fisher to a Hawthorne structure, it's good to know the numbering of carbons in this ring. So we always start with the position to the right where the anomeric carbon is as the 1 position. And then every carbon after that is going to be numbered in sequence. And don't forget that this is a carbon, the CH2 group is a carbon. So there are 6 carbons in this ring, and there are their numbers 1 through 6. Now, what if you have a ketone type sugar where you have this CH2OH group up here that is next to the oxygen on the right and it's attached to the anomeric carbon? Well, in that case, that is where your 1 would start. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Notice something interesting here. Both of these have 6 carbons in them. So they are both hexoses in that, again, they just have 6 carbons. But one makes a 6-membered ring and one makes a 5-membered ring. And that's just because one is a ketone and one is an aldehyde. Now, numbering becomes important when you start to have to form bonds. And we're going to show a bond formation between this glucose and the this 5-membered ring that is shown here. Sorry, this is not a glucose, but this 6-membered ring and this 5-membered ring sugar, we're going to form a bond between them and talk about where bonds can form and how we name bonds. This is this type of bonding between two different sugars, which as a single unit, remember, is called a monosaccharide. Can form a polymer, remember, a chain of sugars. If you only form 2 sugars together, you bond them 2 together, that is called a disaccharide. Now, if you start adding more and more and more sugars together, and we'll see examples of that, that would be called a polysaccharide. So here I'm going to form a disaccharide by bonding my sugars together. Bonds on sugars happen between OH groups. The oxygens in the OH groups are what link sugars together. In particular, the OH group on that anomeric carbon. A bond of oxygen forming between 2 sugars in this way, using this anomeric carbon's OH group, is called a glycosidic bond. And what this looks like is, again, the oxygen from one group is going to form a bond over here, essentially removing this OH group, directly attaching to the carbon here. And so you have a oxygen carbon to oxygen to carbon bond. As noted, this can happen between any 2 points where there are oxygens. So for example, if I was to form a bond as shown between my anomeric carbon's OH group and this OH group down here, what you would see is something like this. We would have our oxygen being the linking point. So here's our glycosidic bond, and it is going from the OH group here, and it's attaching directly to the carbon where that previous OH group was, here. Now, there are special ways to name these glycosidic bonds to tell us where they are forming along a ring. One key thing is that if the glycosidic bond utilizes an anomeric carbon's OH group, then we have to say if it is in the alpha or beta position during its bond. How can we tell? Well, the bond itself will be written in a way that shows the O group either pointing down or up. And just as before, we can use this information to think about if it is in an alpha or beta. So you can see this is pointing down, and our CH2OH group opposite of it is pointing up. These are opposite of each other, and so this glycosidic bond starts from an alpha anomeric carbon. The other piece of information that you need to give is where along the ring, what carbon along the ring it is using to bond. So this is carbon position 1. Remember, let's just number our ring. This is position 1. So we went from an alpha 1 position to, we draw an arrow to say where it went, a 4 position. Now notice I don't have to say alpha or beta here because the second ring is not utilizing its anomeric OH to bond. It's using another OH along the ring. Let's look at another example. I have a blank ring here. I haven't even drawn in its OH group on the anomeric carbon, but let's say that we bond this ring with another version of itself. And this time I want to bond it utilizing the anomeric carbon's OH group for both parts. So essentially I want to combine this OH group and this OH group into a bond. Well, it's a little hard to draw it this way, as you can see, because they're not facing each other. So one method that can be utilized to better visualize this, and you will see sugars drawn this way, so be wary, is that we're going to flip this sugar over. We're going to flip it so that the OH groups are facing each other to better visualize this bond. Now, when I flip a sugar, when I flip it around, everything that was facing up will then be facing down, and anything that is facing down will then be facing up. So I'm not rotating this. I'm not rotating it 90 degrees where the oxygen is facing at the bottom. I'm actually taking this as though it was a pancake and I'm flipping it over. Okay, when I flip it over, the ring itself looks the same. The flat part of the ring looks the same. But now my OH group is over here. And I'm again just drawing it with a squiggly line because I haven't said whether it is alpha or beta. Our CH2OH group is now facing down. And all of these OH groups are facing up. This guarantees that the sugar is still properly written in all of its positioning and its orientation when we flip it. Okay, let's form a glycosidic bond between these two H groups. I'm going to say that our glycosidic bond, when formed, looks like this. I've drawn this kind of squiggly on purpose, and it's to show the direction in which those anomeric carbons are bonding to the oxygen. Remember, that is important because when we utilize the oxygen, the OH group on an anomeric carbon for a bond, we have to say whether it is in an alpha or a beta position. So let's name where this bond is going between, what type of bond this is. And again, I'm going to number this to get a better idea of where everything is. And remember that this has been flipped. So our 1 position is here. Okay, let's start with the ring on the left. That's a little bit simpler because nothing has been flipped around. You can see this is going from the 1. And let's now determine if it is alpha or beta. So here's our CH2OH group, and here is the bond on our glycosidic bond. You can see they're both up. They're on the same side. And so this is a beta. So this is going from beta and position 1. And now let's look at the other ring. Here, remember, we're only looking at the relation of this bond to the CH2OH group. And again, these are both down here, but they're both on the same side. So this is also a beta 1. And that is how you would write this type of bond scheme.